We are almost there.
My eyes are closed. Even when I'm trying, I can't get the right face. You are muted, Kit.
Okay, now we are here.
Now we are here.
And people are starting to come in, and we'll let folks introduce themselves. Go ahead and say hi in the chat, folks, as you come in. People are gathering.
Oh, I'm not caught up.
Folks are starting to dribble in here. It's just 5 o'clock. Welcome to Pat and Tom and Dustin and Carol and Barbara.
No. There. Get out. Often if he makes an appearance, then he behaves himself, but
Well, we could have Jake with us.
we'll see.
Well, mine were here, but they left because they heard dinner being made in the kitchen. So
Oh, okay.
Mark.
There he is. See,
I'm brazen in this late stage of pandemic.
well, mine were here, but they left because they heard dinner being made.
Okay, well, as people are coming, if you all are ready, I'm going to go ahead and introduce Elaine. And today we're welcoming as our guest Elaine Hardy, who is the City of East Lansing's first Diversity, Equity, Inclusion Administrator. She's also chair of the Dr. Martin Luther King Jr. Commission of Mid-Michigan. She recently won the Athena Leadership Award from the Lansing Regional Chamber of Commerce and has continued to serve in our community and our city for a number of decades, helping East Lansing become a better and stronger and more welcoming community. So we are very glad you're with us today, Elaine, and we're looking forward to what you have to tell us about this city.
Thank you, Pastor Kit, and I'm very honored to be here today, and I'm so just blown away that you would mention the Athena. Every time I hear it, I always think that they're going to talk about somebody else. And so it's still kind of overwhelming for me. So thank you for the opportunity to be here. And I'm hoping that I can contribute to a healthy and productive and informative discussion around repairing the breach. And so Pastor Kit, if you're ready for me, I can go ahead and start sharing my screen. Well, great. So I guess I want to begin by trying to frame up my comments today. I'm going to talk a little bit about the what I'm referring to as civil rights milestones that happened in East Lansing, some of which have some national implications that I don't think that as a community we talk about enough. And I hopefully will be able to contribute to the discussion that we're going to have around housing discrimination and to talk about it in a way that I'm hopeful that is productive around the whole conversation of reparations. And so I am going to go ahead and share my screen. Not sharing. There we go. I'm hoping that you can see my screen. Yes, give me a thumbs up. Great, thank you. And so I just have a few slides that I want to just kind of go through to talk about as I refer to some of the milestones in civil rights in East Lansing. So we all know that the city of East Lansing was incorporated in 1904, and we were fortunately not named Collegeville, although I think that there's some still holdouts for people who thought that that might be a perfect name for us. But we got the very original name of East Lansing, Michigan. Again, in 1904, we were incorporated. I want to actually make sure that we recognize that we are still occupying the ancestral, traditional, and contemporary lands of the Anishinaabe, the Three Fires Confederacy of the Ojibwe, the Odawa, and the Potawatomi peoples. And this was land that was ceded in the Treaty of Saginaw in 1819. And so we occupied that land. And I just want to make sure that we, as we talk about housing discrimination and reparations, that we're really paying homage to the full context of that conversation from the First Nations that were here. So I'm going to talk a little bit about East Lansing and its early history and it being known as a sundown town. And for those of us who are not familiar with the terminology, Sundown Town, it was a city that was dangerous for Black Americans, for Black people to be in with the city limits when the sun went down. So it was not just African Americans, but people of color. And although there are residents in East Lansing who happen to be from the BIPOC community, there's some people in the greater community who believe that East Lansing is still a sundown town, that it's not a safe place for Black and brown people to be after dark. What sundown towns are white communities, neighborhoods, or counties that exclude Blacks and other minorities through the use of laws, discriminatory laws, which we're going to talk about those, harassments or threats of violence. And the name comes from posted verbal warnings that would tell Black people that they could work in those communities, but when the sun went down, they would have to leave. And it didn't always necessarily refer to just people of African descent or Black people. It would also prohibit Jews, Indigenous people, Chinese, Japanese, and other minority groups from being in those towns after dark. So one of the things that we don't talk about in relation to sundown towns is kind of their prevalence throughout American cities, both in the North and in the South. And we oftentimes as Northerners think that this kind of very overt discrimination against Black people really was a Southern thing, like it didn't happen up North, or it doesn't happen up North, but it did. There was a significant event that happened in Marion, Indiana in the 1930s where these Black teenagers were killed, and it actually resulted in all 200 of the Black residents that lived in that town moving out of that town. And so it is a part of our American history with regards to building communities that I don't think that we talk about enough. And I know that sometimes the conversation feels uncomfortable because it's ugly, right? We don't want to, it's appalling for us to think that we would harass, arrest, murder, or do unspeakable things to people just because they wanted to be in a community or live in a community. But I think that in order for us to get past this, right, for us to begin to heal as a nation, that we have to have the messy, hard, uncomfortable conversations. And that particular thing that happened in Marion, Indiana is something that I think that we need to talk about as a country and as a community. So what Sundown Towns did was it prevented Black people from being able to kind of freely travel throughout the country. And so and in 1930, for instance, there are only about 44 counties along Route 66 of the 89 that would allow Black people to be able to eat or sleep in a motel. And so there was a gentleman by the name of Victor Green who compiled the Negro Motorist Green Book. And what this book did is it allowed and told Black people as they were traveling throughout the United States where it was safe for them to go with their families. Let's sit with us for a minute. So we had to publish a book that would say, hey, these are the places where it's safe for you to travel to with your family. This book apparently had been widely used up until the mid 1960s. So that's, I mean, every time I think about that, that it was in the mid 1960s that we were still using a publication like this to keep people safe while they were traveling, it just really kind of blows my mind, actually. So East Lansing, when we talk about being a sundown town, it maintained its all-white community status until 1964. So from its inception in 1904, there is not on record that I have been able to find through my research home ownership in East Lansing by a Black person until 1964. And I'll talk about who that Black person was in just a few minutes. But we did the same thing that many of the communities did across the country. We had restrictive covenants that kind of worked along with these unscrupulous lending practices by white-owned banks, collusion with realtors that would keep people from who could purchase homes from buying homes. And then this whole kind of conversation that we are going to have about redlining and about what that means and how that practice dated back to the 1930s. And again, East Lansing was a participant in the redlining, as well as the restricted covenants. And we still see even today that they exist in deed restrictions and in neighborhood agreements. Although they are unenforceable now, they still existed. But people could not sell a home to a person of color in East Lansing. So I'm going to set this video up a little bit. This is a video that's done by NPR Code Switch, and it talks about housing discrimination. And it's going to be a little choppy at the beginning, because at the beginning of it, our dear friend Chris Rock was telling a joke, and he used some free language that probably isn't appropriate today. So the video is going to start in a little different place, but I think that once you have an opportunity to see the video, you'll understand. And it's going to play for about 6 minutes.
Which tend to be in, let's say, distressed areas. And he's not wrong, because if you look at the way housing segregation works in America, you can
Try it again.
You can see how things ended up this way. Once you see it, you won't be able to.
Elaine, you might have to share it separate. Oh, there it is. Okay, we can see it.
I want to show you how to see housing segregation in schools, in health, in family, which tend to be in, let's say, distressed areas. And he's not wrong, because if you look at the way housing segregation works in America, you can see how things ended up this way. Once you see it, you won't be able to unsee it. Okay, let's look at MLK Boulevard in Baltimore. I want to show you how to see housing segregation in schools, in health, in family wealth, in policing. But first, an explanatory comma. It's the 1930s in the wake of the Great Depression. FDR is president. He wants to bring economic relief to millions of Americans through a collection of federal programs and projects called the New Deal. One part of that New Deal was the National Housing Act of 1934, which introduced ideas like the 30-year mortgage and low fixed interest rates. So now you have all these lower income people who can afford homes. But how do you make sure they don't default on their new mortgages? Enter the Homeowners Loan Corporation. The HOLC created residential security maps, and these maps, they're where the term redlining comes from. Green meant best area, best people, aka businessmen. Blue meant good people like white-collar families, yellow meant a declining area with working-class families, and red meant detrimental influences, hazardous like foreign-born people, low-class whites, and most significantly, Negroes. Again and again on these HOLC maps, one of the most consistent criteria for redline neighborhoods is the presence of Black and brown people. Let's be clear, studies show that people who lived in redlined areas were not necessarily more likely to default on their mortgages, but redlining made it difficult, if not impossible, to buy or refinance. So landlords abandon their properties, city services become unreliable, in most places crime increases, and property values drop. All of these conditions fester for 30 years as white people flee to the brand new suburbs popping up all over the country. Many of those suburbs institute rules called covenants that explicitly forbid selling homes to Black people, and all of this was perfectly legal. Now it's 1968, and MLK is assassinated.
Good evening. The Reverend Dr. Martin Luther King, 39
Apostle of nonviolence in the civil rights movement, has been shot
Martin
to death.
Luther King was shot and was killed tonight in Memphis.
In the aftermath, Congress passes the Fair Housing Act of 1968. It's a policy meant to encourage equal housing opportunities regardless of race or religion or national origin, and it offers protections for future homeowners and renters, but it does little to fix the damage already done. Over the next 50 years, the Fair Housing Act is rarely enforced. So you can still see housing segregation and its effects in Baltimore and often along any MLK Boulevard in any U.S. city, like its effects on wealth. So home ownership is the major way Americans create wealth, right? Well, discrimination in housing is the major reason that Black families, up and down the income scale, have a tiny fraction of the family wealth that white families do, even white families with less education and lower incomes. For almost 30 years, 98% of FHA loans were handed out to white borrowers. Not only were Black neighborhoods redlined, and not only was the Fair Housing Act selectively enforced, if at all, but it is still, today, much harder for a Black person to get a mortgage or home loan than it is for a white person.
Families are fearful of speaking up about a basic human right that should be afforded to everyone in the world, but definitely in the richest country in the world.
And housing segregation in schools. The primary way that Americans pay for public schools is by paying property taxes. People who live in more valuable homes have better funded local schools, better paid teachers, better school facilities, and more resources. Here's a feedback loop. The better the schools in a neighborhood, the more those homes in that neighborhood are worth. And the higher the property values of those homes, the more money there is for schools, and so on and so on. And housing segregation in health. Because of urban planning that benefited those richer, whiter neighborhoods, people of color are more likely to live near industrial plants that spew toxic fumes. They're more likely to live far away from grocery stores with fresh food, and in places where the water isn't drinkable. They're more likely to live in neighborhoods with crumbling infrastructure and in homes with toxic paint.
When you're living with rats, roaches, and things like that, that's deplorable. You cannot have that kind of stuff with children running around in a building that may be full of lead.
And not coincidentally, people of color have higher incidences of certain cancers, asthma, and heart disease. And housing segregation in policing. Housing segregation means we are having vastly different experiences with crime and vastly different experiences with policing. Because our neighborhoods are so segregated, sometimes racial profiling can be camouflaged as spatial profiling, where living in certain areas can make you more likely to be stopped by the police. And it means that people have a lot of unnecessary contact with the criminal justice system just because of where they live.
The problem in our city, the police and the citizens are fighting. They keep targeting my brothers and sisters who don't really have nothing.
And that heavy, aggressive kind of policing that you see in Black neighborhoods in particular makes people feel like they can't trust the police. And when people don't trust the police, crimes go unsolved, and people have to find other ways to keep themselves safe. But of course, it's not just Baltimore, because housing segregation and discrimination fundamentally shape the lives of people in nearly every major American city. It really is in everything. To hear more about how race shapes American life, visit npr.org/codeswitch.
So I show that video really to kind of put into context the conversation that we have to have, that the discussions about housing discrimination and reparations, we have to frame them right in this larger context of, you know, the wealth gap that exists now between Black Americans and white Americans, and really how those kind of four quadrants of our lives and how they intersect with one another, how very differently they are for a lot of Black Americans, and what it means for us when we start having conversations about how we repair the breach and what the next thing. So I want to kind of go back to this conversation specifically as it relates to East Lansing and housing discrimination. So in 1962, President Kennedy signed an executive order banning housing discrimination. And it was that executive order that a resident of Michigan, specifically a faculty member at Michigan State University, used to sue the Lansing Board of Realtors in order to purchase a home in East Lansing. So East Lansing, and this is really very significant, East Lansing was the first community in the country to challenge housing discrimination based on John F. Kennedy's executive order. And it happened when Robert L. Greene wanted to purchase a home at 207 Bessemer Avenue. And he was a recruited faculty member, a PhD at MSU, and he wanted to buy a home in East Lansing. Now, significantly about Dr. Greene is that he worked as the National Education Director for the Southern Christian Leadership Conference and was an aide to Dr. Martin Luther King Jr. But in my conversations with Dr. Greene, he said, Elaine, I didn't intend for this to become, a movement. I just wanted to buy a home for my family. I wanted to buy a home and live in East Lansing. And it was at the time, President Hanna said, Dr. Greene, I'll buy a home and you can just buy it from me. And he said, no, I cannot allow you to do that, because the next Black person, the next African-American that comes behind me will have a problem buying a home in East Lansing. And so there went him taking this executive order and successfully suing the Greater Lansing Board of Realtors in order for him to purchase a home in East Lansing. So he became the first Black person to purchase a home in East Lansing through a realtor. He used that opportunity for that executive order to kind of set up a civil rights war room, if you will, at 207 Bessemer Avenue. And so some of the things that came out of the home at 207 Bessemer Avenue was the East Lansing HRC, the Human Rights Commission. And one of my favorite is a group of football players came to see Dr. Greene and said, listen, there are no Black officials. When we play football, there's no Black officials. So they developed the strategy of the boycott for the NCAA in the basement at Bessemer Street. Now, they didn't ever have to go through with it because they relented and hired Black officials, but that happened in East Lansing. And I thought, when he told me that, I thought that was pretty significant. There's so many amazing things that happen at the home on 207 Bessemer Avenue, but there's a historic photo of the home, and Dr. Greene still feels very connected to East Lansing. He did eventually sell this house on Bessemer, and he purchased another home in East Lansing on Bryant Avenue. So there have been some other things that I want to mention that kind of happened along our civil rights timeline in East Lansing. As I told you before, we were incorporated in 1904. It was 1959 when we actually elected the first woman to serve on city council. Her name was Nan Darling. In 1963, Malcolm X came to East Lansing and spoke at Michigan State University. He was a guest, and he came here at the behest of Dr. Greene. In 1964, the purchase of the first home by a realtor in East Lansing by Dr. Robert Greene. And in 1964, Dr. Martin Luther King Jr. spoke at Michigan State University. This would not be the only time that Dr. King came to East Lansing, but I think it was one of only 2 times that Dr. King spoke at the university. In 1968, after the assassination of Dr. Martin Luther King Jr., and after there was federal legislation, East Lansing abolishes the use of restricted covenants and deeds in neighborhood agreements and in all real estate in the city of East Lansing. So then it became illegal for you not to sell a home to a person based on their race or the other protected classes that are called out in that ordinance. And then in 1968, the first woman was elected mayor pro tem. It was Mary Sharp. And those of you who are familiar with East Lansing history know that she was a staple in East Lansing politics for over a decade. And then in 1972, East Lansing bans discrimination within the city limits on the basis of sexual orientation, making East Lansing the first city in the nation to protect the civil rights of the LGBTQI persons, right? So I think that every time I read that, that's a pretty significant thing that happened in East Lansing, right? Part of the DNA of our community that I don't think that we talk about a lot or enough. In 1973, we appointed its first Black person to East Lansing City Council, and that was Ms. Thelma Evans. She was not appointed unanimously, though, I might point out. She did have one dissenter, and I just wanted to just point that out. Then in 1983, we were among the first municipalities in the country to acknowledge Dr. Martin Luther King Jr. Day as a city holiday. We did that 1 year in advance of federal legislation to make Dr. King Day a holiday. And then in 1987, we elected our first female mayor. In 2016, we officially replaced Columbus Day with Indigenous Peoples Day. In 2017, which is something I'm extraordinarily still proud of, that East Lansing becomes a sanctuary city. In 2018, the city makes a formal apology for past housing discrimination. And this was prompted by an essay from a high school freshman. And most of you all know Mr. Hosey because it was part of the kind of reading for this discussion that we're having. And then in 2019, East Lansing prohibits the practice of conversion therapy within the city limits of East Lansing. In 2020, we made a public declaration to become an anti-racist city. And when I think about, the events of last year with the murder of George Floyd and the kind of culmination of this whole conversation that we're having in this nation about race, that's probably one of the things that I'm most proud of, is that we didn't just say, oh yeah, we're going to do DEI work, but we committed to become anti-racist. That means that we said that we were going to actively and publicly work towards fighting racism, not just not being racist, but fighting against racism. We also appointed our first Black man to serve on East Lansing City Council, and you all know Councilman Rob Bankin. We appointed the first Black woman to serve on council since 1964, and that's Dana Watson. The first time in our history that our council is a majority people of color who are serving on the city of East Lansing. And then we also passed an ordinance, which this is big. And I always, say that we didn't go out and do a press release about this, but this was a huge thing for us to change our ordinance. And so we made it illegal in East Lansing for you to call the police on a Black person or any person for doing just benign things. And so I think that was a big step for a community to recognize that we aren't going to be using the police as weapons or as a terrorist for our neighbors. So I was excited that we passed that ordinance. And so that's the end of my presentation. And I want to just kind of leave us with this work that we're doing around the Robert L. Greene Project. I mentioned him in the slide presentation and all of the work or a little bit of the work that he did with regard to civil rights and his impact on civil rights in East Lansing. And there is a group of community members who are working to have the house at 207 Bessemer Avenue placed on the state register for historic places, and a move to make the parkland across the street a historical designation where we can tell the story of East Lansing's journey towards housing freedom for individuals. And then, of course, the same group is looking to rename the elementary school that his children integrated, Pinecrest Elementary School, to the Robert L. Greene Elementary School. And so that kind of concludes my my slide presentation. And I wanted to just share that our hope with my role in the city of East Lansing is to begin our work internally with our staff to build capacity around understanding what equity is, what it is to be an anti-racist organization. And then I get the privilege of working with our community after we have begun the work of building capacity with our staff, but I get the privilege of being able to come out into the community and start having conversations with our neighbors about how they can contribute to making our city a more welcoming and affirming and anti-racist place. So that's kind of my work in a nutshell and my presentations. I'd love to hear questions and have some dialogue with you.
Thank you so much, Elaine. It is quite a journey the city's been on, and I think All Saints has been part of that journey as well, for good and for ill. Mary Sharp was one of our matriarchs of our church, so her long fight for civil rights in East Lansing is part of our story too. But we're curious what we can do as a community of faith that's been part of the city since 1953, and participated in the good parts and the bad parts. And as a majority white congregation, what we can do to help the city become more anti-racist, because we're on the same path ourselves.
So I think that first of all, as people of faith, we first need to be true to who our convictions are, right? That if we model the behavior of Christ, right, and we begin to look at the humanity of our neighbors first, right, then I think that's the first step. I also think that it starts first with us doing our own homework, our own work, our own learning, getting to a place where we are actively and intentionally seeking out information, right? So that we can learn about the structural and the systemic issues with regarding race that we may not be aware of. I talk to people all the time, and this whole conversation about, I don't understand, like how I thought everybody had the same access and the same, anybody can go to Michigan State University. And you know what, if that is your understanding, then that's probably your perception and it's probably true for you. And until you recognize, like when was talked about in the video with regard to housing discrimination, that there has been a history of people being marginalized and kept out of institutions, of places of learning, out of government. When you don't know that and you don't have that understanding, I could probably talk to you till I'm blue in the face. So the work, you have to be willing to do the work yourself, right? To get your own work and your own understanding. And then as a church community, to really speak out when there is an injustice, right? Speak out when you see something wrong. Understand that there is not a time to be quiet when something wrong happens, when something unjust happens. You have to be willing to be brave or courageous enough to just stand up and say, you know what, that's not right. And we need to do something about this wrong thing that just happened, or this wrong thing that is happening.
Yeah. Kathy, I see you unmuted. Did you have something you wanted to ask?
Well, yeah, I have a comment and then a question. My comment is Mary Sharp, who was a longtime member of All Saints, and in fact, was still a member, alive and kicking when I arrived at All Saints in 1986. Was a terrific member of the East Lansing City Council, was instrumental in passing our civil rights ordinance. And the remarkable red sculpture in front of City Hall, which I think is called Raising Harmony,
Yes.
is dedicated to her memory. And I always think of her when I pass that sculpture. I heard her interviewed years ago, and she was still fully involved in what was going on in East Lansing and had a ton of ideas about what needed to happen. And I think also Elaine's history is really important. I remember hearing about Dr. Green, I think sometime in the 90s. And I couldn't believe that in my East Lansing, my, multicultural, liberal East Lansing, a Black person couldn't buy a home within my lifetime. I mean, I just couldn't believe that when I first heard it. And I think we need to understand that that was present and active in our community for much more recently than we might want to believe.
Mm-hmm.
So my question, we were talking about restrictive covenants and deeds. And I did have to pull my deed. It does not have a restrictive covenant in it, but when my subdivision was platted, it was in Lansing Township and not in the city of East Lansing. But I know that there are restrictive covenants in East Lansing, and I've heard discussions about whether there should be some move by people who perhaps reside in those neighborhoods to try and remove those restrictive covenants. I'm first of all not sure how you would do that legally, but if you could, is that something of significance and importance, or are there other things that really command our attention and are more productive to do?
So I think that I have a couple of answers to that question. Why it would be important to remove it would be to admit that it was wrong, right? And just for your information, Representative Sarah Anthony did propose legislation to remove language in those deeds and covenants. I don't know where it is in the House right now, but she did propose legislation in order to do that. So yeah, I don't know that I necessarily think that it would be only performative to do it. I think that apologizing and acknowledging the wrong goes a long way towards healing. And if we are talking about repairing or reparations, then we've got to have open conversations about the things that were done wrong. I think that is one of the biggest kind of hurdles that we have to get past as a country, right? We don't want to really talk about the ugliness of slavery. We don't want to talk about the ugliness of Jim Crow. We don't want to talk about the ugliness of, separate but equal. We don't want to talk about the ugliness of, the deliberate and systematic marginalizing of communities of color. And if we don't talk about it, first of all, there's so many well-meaning people who will want to help. They won't ever understand what happened, won't ever understand what went wrong, right? And then we don't give voice to the pain that communities of color, Black people feel if we don't have a conversation about it. So I don't necessarily think that it's just a performative thing to do. I think that yes, we should do it, and yes, we should acknowledge the wrong.
I have a question about performative things. A lot of my neighbors have Black Lives Matters signs in their yard, which I think is great, but our neighborhood is still, vastly majority white, and I know that that's a lingering effect of all the previous history in East Lansing. But when I asked if there was a way to actually encourage people of color to move into our neighborhood, a bunch of realtors jumped into the conversation online and said, you can't do that because of the Equal Housing Act, that you cannot favor anybody anymore, and so you can't do a sort of a proactive approach. And I was wondering if that's true, or if there is some way to market East Lansing as a city that actually is welcoming and try and dispel some of these long-standing historical biases and actually make this a place that people of color would want to live.
Right. So East Lansing is one of those places that we love to talk about how diverse we are, and then you can go to most of our neighborhoods and they're predominantly white. Like they're just predominantly white neighborhoods. But I also like to have the conversation about housing in this context. That let's not talk about affordable housing. Let's talk about attainable housing. Let's talk about equity in housing that looks like, and I'm probably going to get in trouble for saying this, but I'm not speaking on behalf of the city. This is my opinion. But it's housing that looks like the Avondale Square project. That if you would drop somebody in the middle of that community and say, pick out for me the house that's income qualified and the one that's market rate, nobody could tell the difference, right? That doesn't scare people who live in these very stable, upscale, affluent communities. If you start talking to your neighbors about building affordable housing in their back door, that's going to make them nervous, right? It's going to make them nervous for the big reason. Why? Because they're going to be concerned about their property and they're going to wonder who's going to live there and all of those other things. But if we start looking at how we can develop and create communities and neighborhoods in East Lansing that look more like Avondale Square than they do when you start talking about building affordable housing and moving all of the marginalized people into those places, or all of the people who can't really afford to live in East Lansing into those places, then we have a whole different conversation, right? Because the same way that those homes on Avondale Square all appreciated in value, so did the ones that were income qualified. And that goes a long way to addressing the whole issue with regard to the wealth gap that exists in this country, that really it was the access to that affordable housing that was subsidized for white people, right? In the 30s and 40s, it was subsidized. You could buy a house for $9,000 or $10,000 in the suburbs in the 1940s, 1930s. And now some of those houses are worth $400,000 or $500,000. So those families were able to bequeath wealth to their children, right? They could use their house as leverage to help pay for their kids' college. And so it continued to build wealth, build wealth, build wealth. You know, I read a study recently, and I think it was by Citigroup, and they maintain that racism, and particularly racism as it relates to income equality, affects America, has affected America to the tune of about $20 trillion. That's a lot of money, right? A lot of what we could have done really amazing things with in this country. And so, again, my conversation about housing is not, oh, how you get them to move into the established neighborhood or build houses, or, you know, put cheap houses up in kind of declining neighborhoods. I think that the thought about supporting communities and getting people, a diversity of people to move into East Lansing, is really looking at projects like the Avondale Square project. So that's my opinion, though.
And one of the challenges about housing in East Lansing is that the student demand for housing increases the price of housing, because students are able and willing to pay more than a family is often able and willing to pay for the same house. And that's a challenge that we've just got to deal with one way or another, either by making housing income qualified, which I think we could do more of. We do have a few projects or places in East Lansing that have income qualified housing, but it's a challenge to deal with. Mm-hmm. And it benefits the community by getting families, young families,
absolutely,
into the community.
I was heartbroken. My son and his daughter were house hunting, and they looked and looked, and of course I wanted them to move to East Lansing. They could not find a home, and they ended up buying a home, you know, that was, you know, closer to $400,000 out in the West End in Delta Township. I was heartbroken, But really, there was really kind of nowhere they could break into the community in East Lansing because the housing stock is not, very big. And then you would, if they did find a place, and they would have to go in and put a huge investment into a really old home in a great neighborhood, but they just weren't willing to do that. And I couldn't blame them, right? I couldn't blame them. So I do think that if we start thinking about building communities differently than what we have thought about them, I think that we could come up with some really great solutions about building neighborhoods and communities where you would see a diversity of individuals.
Donna, did you want to ask something?
Yeah, I want to move to policing a little bit. Before the pandemic, it had to have been before the pandemic because we all sat in a room together. There was the incident 7/11 that sparked a whole lot of conversation, and eventually, if it wasn't the precipitating factor, certainly spurred on the effort for police oversight here in East Lansing. I'm curious. I'm sure that there's some things you cannot. I'd love to know, your deep down personal opinion. I'm sure there's some things you can't say as staff for the city, but I'm curious if you're involved in the conversations about police oversight in your role in DEI, and how you think that's going. Do you think it's going to be effective and useful, or is that something that is just kind of performative and maybe not going anywhere?
So, okay, I'm going to answer that question in a whole bunch of different ways.
Okay.
I do get an opportunity to kind of watch the process, right? What council did was stand up a study commission, right? A study committee that would make recommendations on what a police oversight commission would look like. And it looks like through that group, they're going to continue to rely on the work of my office to be involved in complaint review or to take complaints. So, but it gets a little tricky with, how deeply involved someone outside of the policing structure can be involved in that because of the police contract and the agreements that we have with the police unions. So to answer your first question, yes, I'm involved in those meetings. I'm pretty silent though, because we're watching the community, right? That's the role right now that I get to play, is to kind of watch the process and be there to help support the community as they make recommendations. And then later, my role will be to, do complaints. And I believe the recommendation is that complaints and review will come through the DEI office at some kind of way. Mm-hmm. Do I think that that this committee or in general police oversight? Police oversight committees or commissions are not new, right? They exist everywhere. They even exist in communities where Black men have been murdered or killed.
Yeah, and including federally mandated police oversight commissions.
Exactly.
Yeah.
So I think that they are only as effective and as good as the commissioners are willing to push, right? We can stand up committees that will, take on where they believe injustice and wrong things are, or they can, kind of just exist to exist. I don't know, I wished I had a crystal ball to really kind of see what will, the end product of what council will recommend. But what I'm hopeful of is the city has made a commitment to become anti-racist. Mm-hmm. And so our police department has no other choice but to kind of follow through with that commitment by being partakers of the realignment that we're doing, by being participants in the work that we are doing as a city organization to become better than what we were, right? Mm-hmm. And so, time will tell. I really feel strongly that the community should be the deciders of how they are policed. And I'm going to say that again.
Yes, please.
I feel very strongly that the community should be the deciders of how they are policed. Yes. I think the community should decide on what laws that they want to live under. Mm-hmm. And I think that the police has to be accountable to the community. Yep. And I believe that our current administration understands and feels the same way. Good. But, police and police culture is something that is a phenomena across this country that I think that we as a society have just begun to pull the curtain back on, right? We are just beginning to have the conversations about the origins of policing and what that means for Black and brown people, right? And so when we can get the larger community to understand that the police are for some members of the community a scary bunch of folk, you know, whether they intend to be or whether they are not. A lot of Black people, and we learned this from our study that we just recently conducted, that Black people feel negatively impacted by the police in greater numbers than white people. And I want to say this because it really shouldn't be a distinction. If one segment of our community is feeling harmed by the police, then all of our community is, because we are one community. And we need to figure out why that is, right? Whether it's from history, whether it's from, you know, personal experience, we need to figure out why that is, and we need to work towards resolving that. And I believe that we are committed to doing that. I wouldn't have signed on to do this job. I was perfectly happy, if anybody knows this about me, perfectly happy being at the community center, where I got to see the entire community come together, and to be a part of, you know, the 160 or so thousand people that came in their year. But I'm drawn to this work because of my work with the MLK Commission, you know, 22 years of doing social justice work. This was just important to me. I've been a resident of East Lansing for over 30 years. I love this community, and I have said this and I will keep saying it. If any community in this country can really work to become anti-racist and be committed to that, I think East Lansing is that place. I think East Lansing can. So hopefully that answered your question.
Absolutely. Yeah. Yeah. And I agree with all of it.
We have some questions from the chat. Dustin wonders, he thinks it's great that East Lansing apologized for its past sins, but wonders if the city has made any move to take action, like perhaps offering home loans or grants for people of color to get housing in the city.
That would be a council decision, and we have not formally, and I think that that's a great question that Justin should pose to council. Because if you've been following, Evanston, Illinois did something very similar to this just recently. And so that's a great question to ask council.
Yeah. Carol wonders, has the increasing development of large apartment and other housing complexes left smaller homes in the city more available and affordable?
I don't think that we have a lot of housing stock. I'm in the market for a home right now. And every time I see a house that I think I might be interested in, the next day the house is gone. So I don't think that there's a lot of housing stock available. The better person to ask that question would be Annette Irwin, our housing administrator. But we don't leave a lot on the table when it comes to housing. Now we may see it play out, right, with, you know, how much occupancy, you know, what percentage of occupancy happens with those big developments downtown, and what is left in the neighborhoods. Maybe there may be some shifting, but I don't know. I haven't seen it.
I wonder if that will shift when the new sophomore class arrives and both freshmen and sophomores have to live on campus.
Well, it's interesting. The city just engaged a housing study. Yeah. And the results of that were beginning to be presented to council. I don't know as the entire amount of information has been presented. I don't think at this point there's any clear indication that single family homes will empty of students as a result of all of the other student housing that's available. I know that's been suggested as a possibility, but as somebody who's been involved with housing in East Lansing for quite a few years, you have to understand that that's a different price point for the single family homes than there is for these high rises, which are astoundingly expensive. And so the kids who were in the homes aren't going to move into the high rises because they can't afford it. And some kids want to live. That's their choice, is to live in a neighborhood. in a house. So I'm not sure that addition of student housing or the requirement to live on campus through your sophomore year is really going to impact the kind of houses that people might buy as their first home and move into as a family home. I mean, I guess many neighborhoods would like to see that happen, but I don't think we can count on it. I mean, I think we need to do, there is a community housing partnership, which it does assist some people in buying their first home, and I'm not sure of all the way that works, but East Lansing does participate in that program. But other than that, I don't think there's much as far as getting what I would call entry-level housing market people moving into East Lansing, which is what I'd like to see and would help people of color as well as others who right now don't own a home. We can't afford to own a home, but would love to own a home, and we'd love to have them in East Lansing. So
there was a policing question about, do the decisions about East Lansing police also apply to MSU police? And we know that MSU PD is different. But I'm wondering, Elaine, how much your work connects with any work being done at MSU around policing, or around, I know the university has different issues of diversity, equity, and inclusion, but is there conversation across Grand River Avenue, or is it the Great Divide, like sometimes it tends to be?
So you know that there are mutual agreements between the police department to provide aid and services when they come.
Right.
So there has to be some coordination. Through my work, not yet. I actually just had the pleasure of having about an hour meeting with the new vice president and their chief diversity and equity person, or I don't even know his title, Dr. Jabbar Bennett. And so we just preliminarily began to kind of have some conversations about how we can shore up each other's work, right? The work that we're doing in the city and the work that's happening on campus. And so stay tuned for that. But as far as cross coordination with D&I work, probably the better answer for that question would be, our police administration and MSU, but I don't know of any work that's happening right now.
Okay. And then I don't see any more questions in the chat. This is last call. We'll give them a last call, unless Kathy or Donna have anything else you want to ask.
This isn't really a question, but pointing out in the Code Switch video, he talked about feedback loop and talking about the economic impacts of decisions. And it's worth noting that the PPP loan that were available to businesses of all sizes did not go to businesses of color in communities of color at the same rate that they did to white communities. The president mentioned this last week or the week before. And that is a really, there's a whole long history of why that is, how banks function and, all that. It is part of that feedback loop that we saw play out over the last, 12 months.
Absolutely. And there's a very interesting history with Black and Brown communities with banking institutions. Yeah. And, the whole kind of, even going back to trying to buy a house to get a mortgage, the collusion that happened with, white, with white lending institutions. And even in the video, when it talked about 98% of FHA loans going to white people, like you've got to be able to, start putting things together and understand contextually that there's so much work that we have to do in this country to kind of bridge the gap, right? To create even a semblance of equity, right? There's so much that we are going to have to do, and so much work that we are going to have to, continue to advocate for. And you asked me, Pastor Kit, when we first came on, what can you do? And I really, hope that in my answer that when I started saying that to do your homework, to do your hard work, your work first. But there's, other organizations and congregations that you can partner with and join with them to do the work. Putting a Black Lives Matter sign in your yard for a lot of people is a huge first step, right? And recognizing that our country has not valued Black lives. And it creates an opportunity for conversations with other neighbors, for you to partner with organizations like the Movement for Black Lives and see where there can be some help. You know, really kind of shining a light on things like the PPE situation, like housing, like policing, and not giving up, right? Because we have a tendency to, when it's out of the news, it's not top of mind. But if we have to recognize that this is a journey that we're on, and we cannot stop midway to our destination or anywhere along the way, because if we do, we're going to leave somebody behind, leave somebody out. And it is detrimental to us as Americans and detrimental to us as a community.
Mhm.
Well, thank you, Elaine, for taking the time to be with us today.
Yes.
This was really helpful and we learned a lot. And I know it's just the more seed for our future conversations as we go forward.
Well, thank you so much for having me. And it was
And
a
thank
pleasure
you
to
to
be here.
Kathy for joining us as our East Lansing Planning Commission expert and All Saints member. It was great. All right, thank you.